Welcome to TrustTalk. Our guest today is Alison Taylor, Clinical Associate Professor at New York University Stern School and Business Executive Director of Ethical Systems. She speaks about her upcoming book and her diverse background in corporate investigations. Her book aims to clarify what it means to be a good business and argues for building ethical decision-making capacity rather than relying solely on rules and compliance programs. She emphasizes the importance of transparency, honesty, and more focused strategies for corporations, and provides insight on how leaders can navigate ethical dilemmas and make decisions in the best interest of their organization. She comments on Elon Musk's decision to lay off the Director of Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability at Twitter, and raises the question of whether more transparency leads to more trust in businesses. She highlights the role of trust in business and argues that transparency alone may not be enough to build trust. Instead, businesses need to establish a track record of ethical behavior and create a culture of integrity that permeates throughout the organization. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Alison, welcome to Trust Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
You are writing a book for Harvard Business Review Press on the new landscape of business ethics. What brought you to study and write about the role of ethics and trust?
It's about my career, really. So I spent 12 years working in corporate investigations, doing pre-transaction due diligence and investigating fraud and bribery and corruption. So I worked, first of all, in the Middle East and Africa, and then in the Americas, looking at what multinational businesses do in what we used to call high-risk emerging markets. That led me to ask a lot of questions about culture and leadership. Then I studied organizational psychology. I originally had a background in political science and history. And then more recently, I worked in corporate sustainability and ESG. So those disciplines provide a very different frame and angle on questions of business ethics. So I became very interested in how we have all these different metaphors and ideas about what it means to be an ethical business. But I would argue we have completely, as a society, lost consensus on what it means to be a good business today. So back in the 20th century, we had this Milton Friedman idea, right, that as long as you don't break the law, anything you do to maximize profit is ethically neutral. We have clearly lost agreement on that concept, but we do not yet, I think, have agreement on what should replace it. So we're involved in the middle of a very confusing debate and discussion, and my book is an attempt to clarify that.
I noticed from your resume, you're Director of Ethical Systems. What is your role in that organization?
Ethical Systems is a small nonprofit research collaboration. It was founded by Jonathan Haidt, who is a famous social psychologist, who is also a professor at NYU Stern School of Business. It is a network of academics. They are mainly social psychologists, mainly working in US business schools. And the mission of the organization is to try to bring the best ideas on business ethics from academia into the corporate sector. So we try to translate ideas from academics and make them practical and make them real. One thing that I have noticed is that there is a lot of amazing research and a lot of great ideas in academia, and yet the private sector seems to completely ignore most of these ideas and keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So we're trying to change the conversation.
Ethics and trust are inextricably linked. We are interested in ethics in large part because we are concerned, sometimes even obsessed, with the question of who we can trust in a world where there is risk and uncertainty. On the other hand, we humans are in our relationships much more concerned about assessing trustworthiness of others than we are in trying to figure out how ethical they are. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think one thing we might ask immediately is whether interpersonal trust and interpersonal ethics translate in a sensible way to the organizational level. As a society, we are very keen to talk about companies being liars and hypocrites as if they are people with a singular brain that can make decisions to be hypocritical and say one message over here and one message over there. A lot of this stems from our legal system, right, which treats a corporation as a sort of person. But the reality, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, is that a corporation is not a person with a singular brain. A corporation is a social system. So it is easy for a corporation to be hypocritical just through lack of internal coordination, lack of a clear strategy, lack of a clear mission and goals, which ends up with different departments promulgating different messages, and the outcome looks like hypocrisy. But I tend to think the problem is our metaphors. We have let a legal heuristic become an all-consuming metaphor for how we think about corporate conduct and how we think about corporate strategy. And I think to a great extent that prevents us seeing the problem, let alone trying to solve it.
So how can organizations build and, more importantly, maintain trust with their employees and customers? And are the common ethical pitfalls that people and organizations fall into when trying to build trust with others?
So I think one thing I would argue, and that I argue in my book, is that the things we name as business ethics are very often really efforts to protect the corporate person and to deflect scrutiny. So to protect the organization and protect corporate value from reputational and regulatory risk. So it is about legal contracts and it is about forms of PR that are designed to shield the organization from scrutiny. And one of the problems is that given the rise of social media, given shifts in values, shifts in expectations about what we want from business, and then particularly the rise of employee activism and employee voice, those metaphors, those defenses aren't working very well anymore. So we really need to change how we think about our ethics efforts. We certainly need to be more transparent and honest, but maybe we also need to be more restrained and exaggerate less in terms of what we think businesses can really achieve. So I would rather see a corporation be more cautious about the problems it can and cannot solve, have a more focused strategy on the problems it can and cannot solve, and stop exaggerating and stop spinning a story in an effort to pull the wool over our eyes.
So following on what you just said, how can leaders navigate ethical dilemmas and make tough decisions when faced with conflicting interest or values?
I mean, I think that what we really have to do is to stop obsessing on rules and compliance programs and to start to build ethical decision-making capacity among the organization. So a good approach to ethics is less about a compliance process. It is less about rules. It is less about leaders barking orders from the top. And it is more about bringing in the wisdom of the collective to make better decisions. It is more about building ethical muscles. It is more about having debates about grey areas. You are based in the Netherlands, and I know that several Dutch banks have got ethics committees that are really based on this model. So they bring in young employees, they debate the questions, they are honest about their strategic trade-offs, and they try to then jointly make decisions based on the wisdom of the collective. I think that is a better approach to ethics than treating this as a fundamental black and white issue that is all about law or is all about right and wrong. Different people agree and disagree on what the ethical course of action is. We need only think about something like the oil and gas industry to see this. So I think we are maybe not benefiting from this very rigid 20th century view of ethics, and that what we need to do is to really build thoughtful capacity for ethical reasoning among the workforce and in society in general.
So how can companies balance the interest of their stakeholders when making ethical decisions?
I'm not sure that you always can, because different stakeholders have different opinions and different agendas. So maybe this is a myth to think that we can manage these trade-offs and create a balance all the time. Any company needs to think about which interests and voices it's going to listen to and which it isn't. And I'm not sure we get very far with a sort of simplistic notion that all we need to do is balance stakeholders' interests and everything will be perfect and everything will be a win-win. Every company has to make tough trade trade offs and consider the right course of action in a very fraught and disruptive world.
What practical steps can leaders take to foster a culture of ethics and trust in their organizations? And can you give us an example of a company that faced an ethical dilemma and how they handled it? How did their actions impact their reputation and trust with their stakeholders?
There are a few things. I think I would certainly say an organization should measure its ethical culture. An organization should ask employees how they feel about their manager, how they feel about speaking up, whether they feel this is a culture where people care about and trust each other. So I think that is one area of work, really enhancing employees speaking up, understanding that leaders don't know anything, understanding that leaders have flawed ethics as well. I think another issue is thinking more holistically about the governance structure. I've mentioned already that it is very easy to wind up looking hypocritical just through lack of internal coordination. So I think it is very important to involve the whole organization in establishing values and environmental and social priorities, understanding there are trade-offs. And then I think we need to have a very sharp strategic focus, maybe not overpromise, maybe not imply that a corporation can save the world, and be much more restrained and sober and realistic about what a company's goals and priorities and mission is. So those would be a few ideas out there. In terms of ethical dilemmas, there are almost too many to name. I'm in the US, and at the moment, everybody is very upset about this train derailment in Ohio and the risk to the residents in East Palestine. And I think we don't even yet know what has happened to the water and what has happened to the atmosphere there. That is a horrible story because this is a story of companies lobbying the government to loosen regulations and have lower safety standards in order to enhance shareholder value. So this is very, very often the story. If we can think about VW cheated on emissions tests with an effort to be number one in diesel in North America. Wells Fargo put its employees under unsustainable pressure and push them to meet impossible sales targets with a view of growing, even though there was not capacity in the market to grow that highly. There's a common theme here, right, which is prioritizing short-term shareholder value at all costs and not thinking about the wider consequences, not thinking thoughtfully about the role of regulation, not thinking about whether strategic priorities and incentives were going to, by definition, force employees into unethical behavior. And these are the themes we see over and over again.
You just talked about regulations. So how do you believe government and regulatory bodies can contribute to promoting ethical behavior in companies? And can you provide an instance of a company that faced accountability by regulatory bodies due to their unethical actions?
There's lots of regulatory action, particularly on bribery and corruption, that is still going on. I think here the points I'd make are twofold. We have very often in the white-collar crime realm, at least in the US, punishments and fines that are not in proportion with the damage that a company has caused. PG&E, the electric utility in California, was responsible for dozens of deaths and no one has been to jail and the fine isn't even that significant. We have Hertz, the auto rental company, accused its customers of stealing cars that were in fact lost in lots somewhere and has paid a fine of only $168 million. So there's a real problem with regulatory accountability. Perhaps an even bigger problem is that via lobbying and political spending and campaign finance, companies are influencing the regulatory process for their own needs and in their favor. So if we go back to Milton Friedman, who envisaged that a corporation should just make profit and it is the role of the government to protect other stakeholders, the reason that that doesn't work is that corporations have increasingly in the last 50 years been able to interfere behind the scenes in the political process, undermining democracy as they go.
How do you think companies can prioritize both ethical behavior and environmental sustainability in their operations and decision making?
The first thing I would say here is that we need to consider these issues holistically. And there is very often a very clear distinction between an ethics and compliance department that is focused on whether the company does and doesn't break the law, and then a sustainability department that's focused on environmental and social priorities. And I would say, I don't think these need to be the same department, but there needs to be a holistic discussion of values and priorities. There needs to be a reduction in the tendency to insist that environmental and social impact has nothing to do with ethical conduct. And I think we need to think in a more sensible way about how we're going to govern for integrity, which at minimum means making sure that you are setting the same direction and pushing the same message via human resources, compliance, risk, sustainability, government relations, and senior leadership.
Going back to trust and the relation with ethics, we hear about the importance of trust and ethical behavior, but how do you think individuals, rather than companies, can practice and prioritize ethics and trust in their everyday lives?
I think you need to be authentic, and I think you need to be self-aware. What I would advise anybody interested in this topic to do is to go and study social psychology. Every human being in the world, or almost every human being in the world, tends to think that they are more ethical than the average person. I very often give talks to people, and I very often start these talks by saying, I do an anonymous poll, and I say, how ethical are you on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being high? And very, very, very frequently, I get 85 or 90% of respondents say they are a 4 or a 5. So just as we all think we're better than average drivers, we all tend to think we're more ethical than average. I think we need to get much more aware of the reality of how human beings behave in groups. We are far more influenced by our social environment than we like to believe. And so I think a lot of this starts with self-awareness and humility.
The reaction of the audience you are just referring to reminds me of an interview I had with David Dunning about the Dunning-Kruger effect.
There you go.
This sounds like an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right?
Exactly. So I think we tend to be very self-righteous human beings. And I think a better approach to ethics is to understand your own limitations.
Going back to an example that triggered my attention when we're talking about ethics and trust, I'm going to talk about Twitter and Elon Musk. He laid off the director of the Ethics, Transparency and Accountability. So what does that tell you about how important Elon Musk thinks online ethics and ethical behavior in fact is?
I mean, I tend to think that Elon Musk doesn't really understand content moderation. He took over Twitter and he said, we're going to have free speech and there's no problem. And now I think he's realizing that if you have total free speech, you repel advertisers and destroy your business. And that there are a lot of people in social media that have spent maybe the last decade thinking about how to manage healthy speech online, how to moderate content for the best possible outcome, how to protect society while not undermining free speech. And I think Elon Musk dramatically underestimated the complexity of these challenges. And now he's in the middle of finding out how that's going to play out for him.
Alison, I conclude most of my interviews with a question, and I pose it also to you. What do you think are the future challenges for young researchers on ethics and trust for the years to come?
I could give you so many answers to this question. I suppose what I would say for your listeners that I think is an extremely interesting topic is the topic of transparency. We talk about transparency as if it's a panacea for everything. We argue that transparency leads to accountability. We have argued that if we just have total transparency, it will be much easier to trust businesses. So I think we need to ask a question. We have seen in the last couple of decades dramatic advances in transparency, dramatic increases in the level of information that is available about corporate conduct. over those past 2 decades, if anything, trust in business has got lower. So it does not seem that more transparency is leading to more trust. And I think we need to ask some far more challenging questions about why that is.
Alison, thank you very much for this interview. And I wish you good luck with all the activities that you mentioned in the beginning of the interview. You sound like a jack of all trades.
Something like that.
I wish you good luck with that and all the best.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.